Dixie Anderson with the World Affairs Council. Tonight, Dr. George Lopez is with us. Dr. Lopez is a Hesburgh lecturer from the University of Notre Dame. Hesburgh lecturers are the best of the best scholars at Notre Dame. His last visit here was arranged by Butch Steffes, which is why I want to tell you about Butch. He was a Notre Dame alum through and through, who of course was very active with the Notre Dame Club of Grand Rapids. Each year along about fall, he would call me and say, "Hey, it's about that time again. Do you want a Hesburgh lecture?" And we usually did. Butch is the reason we have the best of the best from Notre Dame. He really built the partnership between the Notre Dame Club and the World Affairs Council. He never missed contacting me. I'd tell him the topic, and he'd take care of the rest. He loved bringing in someone from Notre Dame. Oh, he loved Notre Dame. Butch, you went too soon. I hope you're somewhere listening to me right now. But more importantly, I hope you hear Dr. Lopez, because he was one of your favorite Hesburgh lecturers. Connie, I know you're here in the audience. We're so sorry for your loss, for you and your family, and our prayers are with you.
Good evening. I'm Ellen Levy. I'm chair of the Great Decisions Committee and a board member of the World Affairs Council of West Michigan, and I'd like to welcome you to our third session of this year's Great Decisions series, our largest, most prestigious lecture and discussion series on foreign policy. We are delighted to welcome Dr. George Lopez back to Grand Rapids this year. As Dixie mentioned, Dr. Lopez spoke to our council on the topic of the uneasy U.S. Saudi Arabia alliance in 2003. We are delighted to have him back to speak to our audience again. We would like to thank our evening sponsor tonight, the Notre Dame Club of Grand Rapids. Anybody here from the Notre Dame Club? Okay. Thank you very much. And of course, we'd like to thank Michigan Radio, our media sponsor. Before we begin our program, let me run through some housekeeping. If you're not a World Affairs Council member, you may join us for as little as $10 a year with our new email membership. If you join after the program tonight, your membership will only be $5 because we will give you a $5 credit towards your lecture ticket cost of $15 tonight. And the rest of your Great Decisions programs will only be $10 a ticket. How many students do we have here tonight taking the Great Decisions courses? Welcome. How many members? Every week there's more. Please remember to fill out the ballots that you have in your programs tonight. We do send these ballots, they look like this, to the Foreign Policy Association, and they compile them from around the country and send results to Congress and the White House. For those of you who have regularly voted with us in last year's Great Decisions balloting, we have a few ballot results brochures you may pick up in the lobby. We also have the Great Decisions book, which we will be happy to share with you for a nominal cost, $20 out in the lobby. Like last week, tonight we're using the armchair discussion format. The speaker will present for about 20 to 25 minutes, highlighting the main themes of the topic, and then the moderator will ask several follow-up questions, which will leave plenty of time for audience questions. If you remember last week, we had very, very good questions, quite a few of them, which were all incredibly interesting. So please prepare questions as you hear Dr. Lopez speak throughout the talk. And don't be shy about coming down to the two microphones that we have in the front. Please come down to the microphones in these two open spaces. You don't need to kneel or sit. You can just stand there. Our moderator for tonight is Dr. Polly Diven. Hi, Polly. We are one of our Great Decisions professors. She is a professor of political science at Grand Valley State University. Now back to our speaker. who is Dr. George Lopez from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Lopez has been writing and testifying to Congress on issues of human rights violations and the problems of economic sanctions for over 20 years. He can help us think through the ethics of the use of force in the global war on terror in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Tonight, he specifically focuses on the U.S.'s exit strategies from these countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George Lopez for his presentation, Endgame, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq.
Thanks very much. I'm astounded at the size of the crowd, and it's, of course, the Notre Dame people seem to have sat together, but that's all right. We can. No, my thanks to the Notre Dame Club, to the World Affairs Council, to Aquinas for hosting this, and just a fabulous collection of folks. I remember back in my earliest days as a faculty person at Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana in the 70s and 80s, the Great Decisions format was just a fabulous way to bridge town-gown relations and have conversations across various issues in what, particularly in the 70s, were still more contentious times. I think we're in no less contentious times in some respects, but our times seem much more puzzling. And I'll admit that when Dixie and Amy and others contacted me about coming and being part of this, I said to myself, I'm looking at the great decisions topics, Mexico, Indonesia, oceans, and they ask me, exit Iraq and Afghanistan. There's something wrong there. Not only is the whole line longer and more difficult, but exit implies that, we're running for the exits. I don't think that that's really what's happened, and I want to reflect on that tonight. But I also know that this is a topic that is going to be ongoing in our culture because we've exited one place, Iraq, and we have yet to exit another. And people talk about the short, the medium, and the long reach of history, about how any of these episodes, as well as our own withdrawal, will be judged. And I hope I can stimulate some more thinking about that and the kind of discussion that makes a Great Decisions program work at its best. So I'm very, very grateful to be here. Let's get right into it. One of the things that I think is most problematic when a great power discusses an exit is at the first, when is an exit a strategic withdrawal? When is it a retreat? When is it leaving with honor? When is it an act of strategic peace building? Will the exit be orderly? Will our troops be sitting ducks? Will the fact that we've announced an exit mean that the other side will take advantage of this, lying low for a period of time, and then the enemies that we're there to defeat will rise their heads up again shortly after we exit? Maybe even the jet fuel hasn't left very much from the tarmac before the new violence that we were there to stop originally begins. I think all of these are interesting and useful questions with regard to our decade-long dilemma in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let me give you my own reading of this, particularly because I think it may lead to some good challenges and questions. The first and most important observation I'd share with you is that the combination of political planning, the combination of a blend of resources of Iraqis on the ground and U.S. and coalition partners planning politically what the military withdrawal would be and the orderliness of that withdrawal, as well as the standing up of Iraqi forces, meant that many of the generalizations that we most feared, particularly that you didn't want to be the last troops to leave because there'd be no defenses around you, the notion that right after we left there would be a dramatic blip in the kind of violence we saw, all of those things seem to not have come true. Now, one could say, well, we've only left Iraq for about 3 months, so we don't know for sure. And there is, I'm sad to say, yes, a dynamic where bombings have been steadily increasing since January. But those are related to factional issues within Iraq, less related to the U.S. presence or lack of it in Iraq. And I want to say something about that in a moment. The discussion has been with regard to Afghanistan that by announcing a withdrawal date of 2014, maybe now even backing it up significantly to the end of 2013, the administration has left us in a position where the Taliban can lay low. Well, the truth of the matter is, if you look at the escalation pattern for the last 3 to 5 years, insurgencies attacks in the northern section near the AfPak border and in the southern areas of Helmand province are about 3 times what they were 5 years ago. The engagement with U.S. troops on the ground, the ability to stand up an Afghan army and really take the fight to the Taliban has led to increased engagements, not less. In fact, the Taliban can't lie low, which may be one of the reasons why they now want to talk. And I think that's significant. So my first point would be, while we've had political fears, while we've had historical evidence that great states don't depart military engagements very well, while those things often go bad politically or militarily, one of the things that I think is clear about the Iraqi withdrawal and the plans for strategic exit from Afghanistan is that there was much more success to this orderly dynamic, no more significant loss of American life, and a political dynamic going on to lead to greater likelihood of political peace than many would have predicted. Is the full jury out on this? Yes. More time will tell. But we've crossed one of the first and most significant hurdles. The second thing I think is noteworthy, and is actually not very well addressed in our preparatory materials, is that we internally in the United States have avoided, I think, rightly and consciously, the worst kinds of political discussion about this. That is, we've thrown off the bad shackles of the Vietnam era, which many of us in this room looks like we were involved in some politically mature way in high school, college, or beyond. And rather than arguing about, we should have left this to the generals to figure it out instead of the politicians, and then we would have really had victory, or arguing about who's losing Iraq now that we've left it, or arguing about whether or not the blood and the treasure was worth it, we're asking deeper and more significant questions. What's the prospects that a reasonably stable Iraq can move further on its own, given what the American investment and sacrifice will be? And let's recognize, as we ask that question, that our job in Iraq was one in which the Iraqis continued to fight one another on sectarian lines, unfortunately, even with the largest presence of American troops there. I got in a lot of trouble in 2006 for writing an op-ed in which I said no cultural critique meant, but Iraqis, as long as they have the level of disagreement that they have and live in a country that's armed to the teeth, will find new and terrible ways to kill one another, no matter how many Americans are there. Now that the Americans are left, the spoilers to the peace and political process are still finding new ways to kill one another. Anywhere from 36 to 65 bombings in that country a day. Some spikes beyond what the American presence had in its last months, but this has been a continual pattern, unfortunately, since 2004. The quest for political stability in Iraq is not something that was in our hands beyond a certain level. And fortunately, I think in this country, we haven't made that a debatable political issue. I think we've recognized that. The same thing, I think, spills over to our understanding and thinking about Afghanistan, although I think we ought to debate political worldviews about when to leave, under what conditions, and what do we continue to owe Afghan people and society, given our investment and given our commitments there, and given the challenges between the 2 or 3 contending factions, which are much further apart politically and culturally and religiously in Afghanistan than they certainly were in Iraq. But I think that avoiding of the political nastiness in this country is significant for the future role we can play, both privately and publicly in each of those countries. Let me also say that I think that one of the dynamics of the exit that is yet the untold story is the dramatic cooperation that went on with many agencies in the non-governmental sector, whether it be Médecins Sans Frontières, whether it be Save the Children Fund, whether it be private church groups that have been involved in exchanges across teenage groups from one country to the other. What we had as part of the investment of America in each of these places has been a dramatic entrepreneurial skill and commitment and numbers of people of a transnational character, which meant that there was a continued growing civilian presence to the task of building stability and peace, and particularly the ability of these civilians, partly State Department personnel, partly non-governmental people, partly volunteers, to combine with locals in Iraq and locals in Afghanistan who sought a greater future based in peace, stability, and economic progress. That's something which has not been paralleled in our prior experiences of being deeply involved in wars. We were never able to build that into our system with Vietnam until 25 years after the war. We were never able to build that into other wars, save situations like the victories in World War II, which of course are quite different than the situation we face now. In fact, the creation of civil society and the vibrancy of that and its prospect to grow is what's the central issue, I think, as many of us wonder about what the future can be for Afghanistan. Our disdain for the Taliban's view of the world, at least the Taliban's view that we know up to now, which is the place of women in society ought not be where many human rights and other guarantees internationally for women should be, the notion of the rule of law being constitutional, not grounded in Sharia, the notion that politics comes from the ballot box and not the barrel of the gun. That particular culture is one in which we continue to stand firm with a growing number of Afghanis who want to turn the tide of that. And that, I believe, is a civil society preparation that many of your tax dollars have contributed to, and many other international parties from Europe and elsewhere have significantly helped to build an infrastructure that will last. The question is, do we need another 1, 2, 3, or 4 years to help sustain that and make it last? I think that's a puzzle. But what really achieves victory in a place like Afghanistan is that fabric of civil society. We can create distance between the Taliban's worst dynamic and the growth of that civil society, and thereby determine the conditions under which any Taliban view will then emerge in the future. And I think that's what's to be debated out. Let me say a couple of other points here. I think Michael O'Hanlon, the guy who wrote the essay in the Great Decisions package, is one of the smartest and clearest writers around. He's been a strong force at Brookings. Those of you who read New York Times and other things know from 2003 on, he's been a firm mapper of rises and falls of violence, tremendous good finger on the pulse, balanced politically, ethically, and the like. But I think Michael fell short for us in a couple of ways. One is, most importantly, he didn't ask the question, where has the exits maybe fallen short, either from Iraq or the potential one in Afghanistan? I don't think he devoted enough time to the notion of the larger enemy both we and those we dealt with in each country need to face. Not al-Qaeda, not terrorist extremism, but rather crime and corruption. The new great enemy of peace, as strongly manifested in these two countries, but in many other cultures of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is the effective transnational groups that are committed to their own gain through the marketing of everything from nuclear materials to human trafficking to drugs and arms, and they cannot thrive in a system that's democratic and run by the rule of law, where civil society groups want no place in trafficking of any of these kinds. One of the challenges we face in exiting is, have we built up not a strong enough army that has certain kinds of reasons to exist in each of these societies, but a strong enough judiciary, police force, civil society factors, and others that see no role for this kind of crime level. The other thing we may not have done to the best of our ability is to guarantee that the governments that we've left in place have the anti-corruption mechanisms that distinguish democratic societies. The popularity of the Taliban is not based on their adherence to Sharia law. The population of the Taliban in certain sectors of Afghanistan is related to the memory that many people have that when the Taliban was in charge, there was virtually zero corruption at the national and local levels. And the Karzai government has lost a great deal of its credibility over the last few years because it's clear in people's minds how many government officials are on the take and making money out of their own, either turning their backs on certain networks or in fact directing and being part of these while also being part of the government. And Afghan citizens reject this level of corruption. They don't want it as part of the system. We need to be tougher with both our allies in Iraq and Afghanistan to purge this combination of the great enemies of peace, crime and corruption. Another part of the exit strategy that I think Michael wasn't quite as clear on as he might have been, and that is that we've learned from the terrible wars in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in bringing peace in Sierra Leone and Liberia and in sections of the Congo, that you need a system of demobilization and demilitarization. While we spent a lot of time building up national armies, we need a concomitant process where those who've been fighting our army and the building up national armies can find a way to turn in the weapons, gain in re-education programs that make them functioning citizens, and we need massive weapon buybacks. Iraq is still a society armed to the teeth. When people celebrate politically by shooting AK-47s in the air, you have a problem. And that I don't mean in a kind of comic sense, but I think this is a very, very serious dynamic that you are going to be a gun culture is going to spill over to a gun politics, no matter how you look at it. The effective demobilization and decommissioning of weapons, as well as the decommissioning of militias that we've done successfully elsewhere, we've not been as successful and as energetic about in these two cultures. Then lastly, I think one of the toughest part of exit is to ask the question, what has been the cultural heritage of us being there? We need a lot of critical self-reflection of that in the U.S., and I'm not sure there's a single answer. I don't think there can be a single answer given the multiple dimensions and impressions and involvements of the United States. For the places where we built bridges, hospitals, roads, and schools in Afghanistan, those people will be endeared to us for a very long time. In the villages where drone attacks killed large numbers of people in their family, those people are now becoming hardened Taliban fighters, not because they're so much religiously persuaded, but because of their own sentiment of revenge that's a strong cultural reality. What's the power and intermingling of the cultures, and where is that going to lead us? One thing we've learned very, very strongly from both country experiences is it takes generation to generation to change another culture, and the change has to come with them, for them, and by them. We can't impose it from without. What lessons we've learned, then, therefore, I think, are significant. That the engagement has to be military to create security and purge a country of its worst kinds of terrorists and spoilers of a peace process. But there's got to be a plan that goes along with that of strategic peace building, which dramatically then engages the rebirth of a civil society so that people themselves see a strength in their institutions, in their interconnectedness, and a commitment not to be out of conflict with the other, but to have defined rules of the conflict engagement, which are a political and social process of debate, dialogue, voting, and democracy, not the politics of conflict from a barrel of a gun. We've had some successes in that. There will still be yet challenges, not the least of which is the conditions under which you engage the Taliban, and I think we'll probably have some great questions about that at the end. I think the American episode that we're coming to the end of in Iraq at one level and will soon come to the end of in Afghanistan leaves a lot of critical self-reflection for us. Some basic questions. Is there such a thing as a winnable war ever again? Are there such things as the ability to change a culture from the outside? Under what conditions can you purge a country of terrorism without creating more sympathizers for terrorism if you do that solely from the outside? And lastly, under what conditions should a great power consider itself a great power? Only part of that may be our ability to defeat our enemy. The other part may be to understand for the people that we deal with that are neither enemies nor friends what most will influence how they look at us in a future, and how they choose their own path to a future in which we'll be engaged. Let me stop there because I'm just a fan of this great format you've created, whereby we can offer some remarks and you somehow have a button that turns me off from the standard professorial 50-minute lecture, and we can have some good interaction. Thank you very much.
Hi, I guess we're supposed to take the chair. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for your comments. It was very, very insightful. I especially like the additions to the O'Hanlon article about the importance of crime and corruption. I thought that was really useful. I'm going to take a few minutes and ask questions of Professor Lopez and then open up the floor, so I'll let you know when it's time for you to start heading for the microphones. The first thing I want to do is talk about what you said, something about the public not kind of getting in the way of the war, or the fact how different it was, the public response to the war versus how we responded to Vietnam. And I'm kind of thinking about whether the public was so engaged during Vietnam War and so disengaged today. Is that a good or a bad thing? I mean, in some ways you could see that as very dangerous, that the public is checked out, not paying attention, kind of not even thinking about what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not a big campaign issue, as you've already noted. To me, that might be more of a troubling thing than you portrayed it as. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Then I may want to correct what I wanted to portray, because
Okay.
I don't think that as a public we're less engaged. What I think we've done is less arguing from the fringes and the most extreme positions with regard to assessing the lessons and the meaning of that exit. I think we have a very, very informed public about how costly this war has been, the war on terror generally, but the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. There's not a community that doesn't feel this in terms of its returning National Guard people, our veterans and the like. It's very, very clear to most people that they understand some of the current economic dilemma in which we find ourselves and the $4 trillion that this war has cost us. So I think people are engaged, but what I think they're not doing is taking the available potshots that might be out there in what otherwise is a kind of partisan political environment. I think what we've realized is that we've come through a dark, dismal, and then increasingly bright time in which everyone had paid a price. Political people, military people, and certainly the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's not that we're withdrawing from comment on that, but rather than saying, well, I know how this works and we should have done this and this, whether it's military people or political people, we're in a period of assessment, quiet dialogue, and trying to see where the next stage goes. So maybe that's a period of critical self-reflection that speaks well of the American body politic and is not necessarily a withdrawal or a distancing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I also wanted to ask something. There was sort of an assumption that the United States was withdrawn from Iraq, and I read an article last week, I don't know how many of you caught it, in the New York Times about how large the embassy is and how there are 15,000 staff people still there in Iraq, including many private security contractors. And so I'm wondering if it's really accurate to say we've pulled out of Iraq, or whether we've really turned it over to a lot of the private security contractors. And I wonder if you want to talk more about the enormous embassy that's left behind and all the staff that are still there.
Well, I've never been a fan of the enormous embassy.
I didn't ask you to defend it. I just wanted you to reflect on it.
Thank you. I think what you're seeing is the residue numbers now are going to be dramatically different in 6 months than in 12 months. Not the least of which is there is now no standing agreement. There's no MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between the United States and the Iraqi government with regard to the status of the contractors. So Iraqi law can charge a contractor under any number of charges if they find them in violation of Iraqi law, or more importantly, if as protection units of ambassadors moving back and forth to the embassy, they fire on Iraqis, even if they consider these hostile Iraqis, they're subject to Iraqi law. So I think the dramatic boom in contractors that we saw occur from 2004 on is in its decline, and it'll be interesting to see where that numbers go. But they are, from my point of view, grotesque. Mm-hmm. The decision to build that embassy when it was taken was a decision to imprint an empire on Baghdad, and it was one of the clearest symbols, particularly for the Sadrists, that American presence must go. So in the medium of creating the embassy, we lost the message we were trying to interact with about the Iraqi people, about what we were trying to bring about equality, fraternity, and the creation of a new democracy. Instead, we created an image of an imperium which, haunts the riverside there in a way that I think we will find someday becoming an Iraqi national museum as we move to more austere and appropriate headquarters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was a comment at the end of the article by one of the Iraqis they interviewed to say something like, well, we're going to open just as large an embassy with as much staff in D.C. and see how you like it, or something like that.
Wait till they see the price of land in D.C.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question about security contractors takes me to another question. I guess I want to remind our audience a little bit about the farewell address by President Eisenhower in the military-industrial complex, because he warned about the potential for the defense industry to impact the objective analysis of national security. So my question is the U.S. extended military action in Iraq and or Afghanistan related to the growth of the defense industry? And in particular, what is the impact of private security contractors on how we profit from U.S. involvement overseas? To what extent is this just war profiteering?
I guess my own response would be it's actually worse than war profiteering. War profiteering in its traditional realm meant that a relatively uncompetitive set of industries would benefit from the greatest amount of contracts in a war. What we have here is actually a lot of good competition among private security firms, but the incredible benefits being doled out to all of them because of conscious decisions in the 80s and beyond that certain functions that made an army run not necessarily needed to be carried out by folks who were in the traditional armed forces, whether that's the folks who cook your meals, the folks who construct your latrines, or more importantly, the folks who manage the command and control communication systems that are now so critical to high-tech kinds of warfare and deployment. With this comes not only a certain kind of economic boom, but a whole set of challenges to international law. The ability of private contractors to be armed, the dependence of the State Department and other personnel on private contractors as their bodyguards. There's something that's even beyond the notion of the kind of political economy of profiteering. There's a legal, ethical, and other dynamic. There's also an equity dynamic. I'm sure many people in the audience know relatives, friends, or just stories of young people who were 6, 8, 12 years in the Marines and provided a particular kind of function and a particular kind of expertise, let's say in communications or in transport or even in understanding where IEDs might be buried. And they leave the armed forces at a pay grade of about $33,000 a year, and 2 months later can be working for a private security firm at $133,000 a year. Well, what's to keep people in the armed forces if that pull of the market is there and the dynamic of that? And so this is a whole new security territory that is being partly examined by people like Michael O'Hanlon's colleagues at the Brookings Institutions have done some of the best studies on this. But this is very, very serious stuff. And it's very serious not only in terms of this particular new dimension of the military-industrial complex, but it's also critical worldwide. One of the things that we've been able to discover, for example, in the documents coming out of Libya that were captured from official government files, from presidential palace and the like, is Gaddafi wasted no time as the demonstrators were taking to the streets to go out in the international marketplace to hire a number of highly trained private security firms to do not only the bugging and high-tech stuff of finding out who was in the opposition and how they were communicating with one another, but also what looked to me like the hiring of hit squads. That is, elite commando forces who would go out and target certain elements of Libyan society that were out in the streets, and maybe even those that would help him fight his way and his family's way to protection at the end days in Libya. So this kind of private contracting is very, very serious. If we get this under more control domestically here, if the market isn't there, then you have this big firm like Blackwater now in its fourth stage of redefined name plating. Where do those people go? They go to the highest bidder. And you can rest assured from at least what some of us have seen that deal in the sanctions business that Mr. Assad has been very active in the marketplace looking for these people, particularly South African commando elite squads that are assassination units.
Now I want to change direction a little bit and ask about, there's been some criticism of the Obama administration for negotiating with the Taliban. I know you've been involved in sanctions and negotiating sanctions over the years. Do you think that's sort of a necessary evil, or do you think that was a wise strategy, or would you criticize the administration for negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan?
I suspect I'd criticize a bad end deal. I'm not sure I'd criticize the negotiation per se. I'm teaching a course in conflict resolution this spring. We do a bit of domestic stuff and a bit of international stuff. And we just did our first session on the ethics of conflict resolution. And I said there's two tensions. One is good peace builders go anywhere under almost any conditions to talk even with scoundrels about peace. That's a good ethic. The second ethic is do not negotiate a peace that compromises core human values. So if you're going to negotiate with scoundrels, it's not the process that you should be worried about. Be very worried about the product and what you agree to, because you have an ethical responsibility for that. And so this is the vintage dynamic here of this. My belief is that war itself is a kind of negotiation. The minute we started shooting at Taliban, we were negotiating with them. We would have liked some of that negotiation to end essentially in either capitulation on their part or their extermination. Now that the combination of social change within Afghanistan and maybe even their reaction to our own techniques leads to a resurgent Taliban, now we're in a situation in which whether or not the prospect of a good, strong U.S. response militarily has led them to the table faces us with the ethical question. I like what I hear publicly, that is Secretary Clinton saying a couple of weeks ago, we're not going to compromise on the notion that they must renounce violence. We're not going to compromise that we deal with no Taliban who has al-Qaeda roots. We're not going to compromise to deal with Taliban or sign an agreement with them that don't swear allegiance to the Afghan constitution. Now, will you be at a table with folks who sort of have the Afghan equivalent of their fingers crossed behind their back when they're doing that? Or you don't ask people to stick out their tongue to see if they're lying? That's a lot of hard political negotiation, and we're going to have to find a level of certainty here. There's a whole lot of trial and error that we can do in this. Interim governments of a regional kind, controlled by the Taliban in the south, and if they're not meeting human rights norms with regard to the treatment of women and others, then they get replaced while we're still there. You can find zones of possibility of autonomous rule and see how far the Taliban have come. And let's see where this goes. Talking isn't cheap. Talking is very, very dear and expensive. But there's no political settlement that I see in the near future that doesn't involve a recognition that the Taliban has some cultural and regional clout and is likely to be a force.
That's really interesting. I'm going to switch again back to domestic politics. And while I'm posing my last question, if you want to come down to the mics and prepare some questions for Professor Lopez, please do that, okay? That's my last question that I have prepared for the moderator. What's that? Is that a question someone wants me to ask? Okay. Anyway, my last question was about the election. And that is whether you would do us the pleasure of commenting on the relationship between U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and the presidential election. I guess there are a couple of options here. Does the election impact the administration's policymaking overseas, or does the war impact voting? Or how do you see the direction of causality here? Do you think those two are tied up?
I mean, I'm just really curious about this. I guess, like, what prompts your own question? I don't feel I have a finger on the pulse. I think the decision to withdraw a little bit earlier, the inability to work out a deal with Maliki, maybe worked very much to the Democrats' advantage, that you were not in the midst of withdrawing troops from Iraq as the campaign cycle. You know, I think the Democrats have the unique ability to claim that we got us out of Iraq and it's not any worse than anybody said 2 years before. The Afghan situation might be an interesting foreign policy debate to see where either Mr. Santorum or Mr. Romney will be on this, to make a stand that I won't negotiate with the Taliban, but by gosh, he will.
That's the kind of thing I was wondering.
Where does that put you in terms of, okay, so how long American troops, I just not exactly sure where the American population is on this. I know one of the things that's unlikely to happen because the forces that we're engaged with, particularly in Afghanistan, don't have that level of strength is, again, appealing to those of us of a certain age in the audience. You know, the way the Tet Offensive dramatically altered American perceptions of Vietnam and essentially forced Johnson out of the war, out of the race, and changed the spectrum of American politics. I don't see any functional equivalent of that in either Iraq or Afghanistan. So I think there's a kind of insularity around all of the candidates, with some advantage probably going at the start to the Obama administration. Where I think the debate will be is in the size of the military budget, and a decision by the Obama administration to cut military budget in addition to cutting domestic spending. And the Republicans may be trying to seize the fairly traditional Republican platform of, by gosh, that weak, weenie guy on defense, not me, I'm going to keep the military budget where it is. Then you have this little dilemma of Leon Panetta, who says, but that reinforces the worst of an over-heavy armed force where we need an elite mobile thing that will cost us less under these conditions. And so it'll be interesting to hear the arguing of strategy. But I don't think there's any deep fissures or divisions between the parties, really, and therefore not things that they can accent, which really sort of put a voter in a kind of quandary. Whereas I think voters were in a kind of quandary in 2004 and a bit in 2008. I don't think we're going to see that this time.
Interesting. Now, am I to read these questions? Is that why you handed me? Excuse me? They're texted questions. Oh, they're texted questions from the audience.
Am
Okay.
I supposed to have my phone on?
No, I guess they've been texted to you, and I'm going to read them. Okay.
All right.
I didn't know we had that capacity. All right, are you ready?
Yeah.
Could our efforts in the Middle East be ended without all the pageantry? Well, we'll never know what the author meant exactly, but I'll let you take a stab at
I'll
that.
interpret pageantry as drama. Particularly, let's say, a kind of hyperbolic approach to Iran here. If I were to go on a little bit longer, one of the things I would have said about Michael's good article is, you know, he says that we had a dilemma in the way that Iraq and Afghanistan are ending, in that it's often difficult to bring a successful end to a civil war if you don't have the full cooperation of neighboring states. That's true empirically. But if that's true empirically, then one of the things we did poorly in our exit is we didn't involve, from the start of our negotiation of our exit, the neighboring states as supportive mechanisms in the future stability of Iraq or Afghanistan. I don't know how you build a peace in Iraq for Iraqis, with Iraqis, and by Iraqis without a strategic partnership with Iran. If you're going to have Iran as the great enemy, but Iraq is the great friend in which we've invested all of these things, there's nothing in history that supports that strategy. So if pageantry is the muscle flexing in the Gulf of Hormuz, the Straits of Hormuz, if it's this notion of pound them with more sanctions because they might or might not have a nuclear program, that kind of pageantry, I think, is very, very much in the wrong direction. I think we need a strategic engagement with Iran for the long term that creates the greatest chance that our investment of Iraq will actually be successful. I think the same is true with regard to the jockeying for position with who's in charge of fighting the extremists in Pakistan. We can't be running drone warfare that's a privatized war of the United States against certain targets in Waziristan. That's got to be the work of the Pakistani government, buttressed by us.
Otherwise, it just creates too much anti-Americanism, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it feeds exactly the wrong cycle. It creates more enemies than friends.
Right. I just want to remind everyone that if you're not a texter, you can certainly come down and ask a question at the mic. The text has no... would you like to go ahead? Why don't you go ahead, and then I can read the question after.
Text.
We can alternate. That's fine. So we can alternate text and non-text if you like. So go ahead.
In the region that we've been talking about, with the tribal history and that culture that has been going on for forever, how do we turn that around, or can we turn that around in the short time that we've been there, or how do we even think that we can turn that around when there has been no central government, no allegiance to a government, when the allegiance has been to a tribe?
I think that's a very obnoxious question. And it's an excellent one. Thank you, Hal. It really is. It's what leads some people on the one side to say that what we owe the Afghanis is that we need to stay there for more than a generation of Afghanis to help with that cultural transition. Some of us believe that you can create seeds of that transition, but it's really Afghans' job to do that on their own. We can't do that for them. We can barely stimulate it. We can fund some of it. It's very, very difficult to get folks to change their sense of identity unless you've changed dramatically the reward structure, which goes with the identity. And right now, all the reward structures continue to operate in those most rural and mountainous regions to be tied to the tribe. What you need to do is to try to find a way to make a deal with the most elite tribal leaders to say, you can retain autonomy, you can retain certain things, but we can even help make life better, and you will be seen as even a greater tribal leader if you ally yourself with certain larger national dynamics. And some of them will, and some of them won't. The ones that won't and want to fight to the death, unfortunately, that may be the era in which there's continued violence there. But it's going to have to be Afghan on Afghan violence to decide which way that will go. For those who will embrace at least trial and error with the change, we better have the smarts, the economic development strategies, and the other things that produce the rewards that we promise. But it's a roll of the dice. Anybody who says it's other than a roll of dice never took a course in anthropology or has been very few places outside of the U.S. I don't mean that pejoratively. I just really mean that it's a very difficult dynamic.
Why don't you go ahead? Oh.
Yeah, my name is Austin. I'm from Professor Divins' Great Decisions class. And my question is on, you said that one of the ways that we could see our tax dollars at work was through the growth in civil society, but at least some of our tax dollars went towards trying to stop the violence between the sects, and it can be seen that that had nothing to do with American influence because they were happening even when American troop levels were at their highest number. So do you think it would have been possible to create effective civil society without the massive contributions that we made in the form of troops and money and military?
In hindsight, yes. If we want to be fair, as I try to be to the folks going in 2003, 4, and 5, I think we bought into a perception of Iraqis that they will understand force best and respect force best, and particularly with regard to dealing with the Sadrists and to dealing with the Sunni group that later became the Awakening, we believed that their commitment to violence as a way of politics exceeded any other possible option. And so what mattered was the ability to engage them at a different level than the military, in a sense to run two-track diplomacy, military at one level and the diplomatic dialogue at the other, to ask what continued to motivate you to fight. What we did is we brought a lot of money to the field, and for folks that we were fighting and then capturing, saying, who do you know who's upper echelon in your group, and can they be bought? Can they be bought? Can they be bought? And we thought it was a money dynamic or a fighting dynamic, as opposed to a cultural dynamic, a religious or regional autonomy dynamic, and loyalty to tribe. And I think by the time 2006 came along, we used the surge less to increase more fighting by Americans against Iraqis, but the surge to have more deeply penetration of American militaries into areas that looked somewhat Pacific, and we could learn the dynamics of what made people willing to put down the gun for a while. And so I think there's a lesson. I mean, I know there's a lesson now. The Pentagon's own thinking about its strategic peacebuilding division and what it means to engage people at the start, what it means to think about new levels of intelligence gathering as opposed to just looking at firepower. All of that means a different strategy the next time, with most of us hoping is not a next time at that level. And I think we can say that in fairness about, without doing kind of Monday morning quarterbacking and saying to people, aha, now with hindsight we know. I think we can say enough spots and times where there are folks in the military who are doing things in 2007 that they never thought they would do in 2003 by engaging local communities.
All right, thank you.
Good question, thank you.
There are a couple questions about culture that I think are interesting and it's sort of related. How do you deal with an end game in a culture that does not value peace over honor? There's an assumption here that they value retribution over peace, they say. Or you mentioned earlier that changing their culture from the outside. Why does any nation have the right to change another nation's culture, if we don't agree with it?
Let me deal with the last one first.
Okay.
I don't think any particular nation has a right to change another nation's culture, but I think we all recognize that cultures are always about stability, tradition, and how they cope with the challenge of change. We don't bleed people to death anymore trying to bleed them of the virus, the cancer, or the affliction. It was a cultural and medical dynamic that's what needed to be done in a certain period of time, and then we found out there were alternatives that achieved the same goal without often losing the patient. There are global standards that don't need to be imposed on people, but when other people within one's culture embrace those global standards and others are willing to kill so that those new standards are not embraced, I think that's a set of value and conflict dialogues that have to happen in any culture and often do. No culture is stagnant, and the stagnancy isn't related to the fact that people don't want to change or don't see change as possible. The stagnancy is often related to power dynamics where people say, I'm in charge, and I make the rules, and there can be no rules outside of me making the rules. I think those rules can be offered by a global society and not necessarily one particular group. So that's an extended discussion. Back to the first question.
How do you deal with an end game in a culture? Now, there's an assumption here that the culture does not value peace over retribution.
I think the human propensity for revenge, retribution, is a strong one. But it's strongest in places in which there's been no alternative to it. That is, a peace with honor that's based on a recognition, your father killed my brother, my cousin killed your father, we both suffered loss, we both want a future for our children. How do you build beyond the revenge to something like a future? I think part of this, or the flip side of this, is how do you change a culture where people see a self-sacrificing suicide death as the greatest honor they can bring to themselves or to their community? Most of the research that we know exists in suicide bombing is that it's often an act taken because very few other patterns of choice are seen to exist for the young people and others who engage in it. The same thing. I engage in retribution because I can't think there's an honor that comes with peace. There's only an honor that comes with retribution. And the experience of dealing with war, the experience of encountering where do we go beyond this war, I think is what engages local communities to possibly see an opening. But it's a very uphill struggle.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because both questions, I think, are based on the idea that culture is relatively static and not a reflection of the power, which it often is. Right. You've been waiting for a while. Go ahead, sir.
Please.
You referenced the need for personal communication and personal interaction. And yet, in our world, as to the computer, we are becoming more impersonal. And just as to the reference of the drones and the military attacks and presence of the drones, that is totally impersonal versus a soldier on the ground. And is this a conflict that we are ignoring, have not had the chance to mature in our thought processes and development going forward to those nations as well as to ourselves? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, you may be absolutely correct in your analysis that this is a challenge in which we're at a moment where we're as depersonalized than we may have ever gotten. I'm tending to look at the way in which that computer technology, which starts as a depersonal, identifies new roots of the interpersonal that we wouldn't have had before. It identifies ways in which a local church can find what the church-to-church exchange programs are that are out there that can actually organize their people to go on relief missions that they might not have been able to identify before. It's ways in which For example, communities in Iraq can plug into research at the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research International to find out other times where Sunni and Shiite groups have come together for intensive workshops on conflict reconciliation. And they find out that's happened in Jordan and it's happened in a number of other places, and they can bring those people as trainers to their particular place in Iraq to engage in that kind of thing. I think there's ways in which that dramatically interpersonal can lead to the route to engage the personal. And as long as we have it as a means to the end of the personal, I think we experience both worlds, but to the better interpersonal end.
Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. My question goes to the private security firms that you were talking about. You referred to it as war profiteering and such. But what about situations in which the United States military personnel is unable to handle situations due to issues and restraints put on it due to cultural issues in the area, such as in Kabul in either 09 or 10, there was a hostage situation involving children, about 75 children, and the American military was not permitted to go in to handle this situation because it was deemed of cultural relevance. They called in a private security firm, and the only casualties were 4 insurgents. I'm just curious what your thoughts in regards to that are, in the fact that some people who are in the private security firms have been told they cannot re-enlist in the military because they are too old, even though they are more than qualified to handle situations such as that, and the fact that private security firms can deal with things such as this when the American military is told no.
Well, part of the reason that tension exists between a no for the military and a yes for the security firm is at the first level what's called the rules of engagement of battle on the field. And more over time, as we've tried to lessen our footprint in Iraq or Afghanistan while still being there, we've tried to back away from situations that we think are essentially domestic arguments among factions. And I think that was part of what was at the root of this terrible kidnapping. So it's not right for the United States military under these conditions to engage in that. Now, an argument might be made, well, you're letting the innocent children be victimized. I thought you were there for pursuit of justice and a good way of life. Why aren't you engaging it? Well, because that's not a win-win situation for the military given the larger strategic goal. The calling in of a private security firm exposes them to a whole different set of rules. Think about not having the luck and the skill of the assault, and I'm not sure which balance works under these conditions, where 7 of the children were killed, or where the kidnappers decided under assault to kill all of the children. What gave that private security firm a right to do that? And under what rules of engagement should they be evaluated? Because American law can't protect them. Certainly Afghan law isn't going to protect them, except if they're actually able to pull it off.
If I may add information to that, there were no shots fired in the thing until the insurgents came outside. It was negotiated. The insurgents came outside after the hostage situation was in theory over, and then they were
and
they
I
fired
think
upon the security
that's
firm.
a very skilled but also partially lucky situation. The fact of a good outcome doesn't necessarily avoid the discussion of the question whether or not folks who have no rules of engagement and can come and go as they choose and let the consequences of their action just speak for themselves, that's not a good way to do business when it's going to reverberate back to American foreign policy. That's my view. Other people have other views.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier some comments about international criminal networks and the problems that they pose in contrast to military activities. And I'm wondering if you have comments on policies the U.S. should be adopting or changing, recognizing that that's a potent force in international activity today.
Yeah, no, very good. The first and the most important is increase the amount of transnational sharing of intelligence information. We're not talking about high-level national security compromises here. We're talking about a balancing of the computer identification systems between Interpol, UNIDOC, the United Nations Drug and Law Enforcement Administration, U.S., NATO, and local groups. so that you know the people, you find the people who are on the same lists, okay? The same folks who are the Victor Boots of their time, who run the guns, who find ways to undercut the system, who over a weekend repaint the fuselages of planes and go in under different conditions, smuggling guns or drugs yet again. Intelligence sharing is the first issue. The second issue is a recognition, I think, in terms of higher priority national security needs, that while we have large-scale disagreements with North Korea and large-scale disagreements with Iran, if there weren't successful nuclear smuggling networks operating to play off their desires, and if we had stepped up a global cooperation to strangle those networks, we'd have far less national security crisis with either of those entities. So it's a redrafting and re-understanding of the priorities and where your greatest threats may be. And the third, it seems to me, is understanding that the vulnerabilities of these networks run deep. This corruption, bribery, extortion, and recriminalization of local law enforcement units, which let the smugglers operate, used to be in the minds of many people just the kind of wink, blink, and nod that happens. You know, whether it's getting the scotch to the great leader in North Korea on a yacht that's smuggled in, and, you know, who really gets hurt by that? That may operate today, but tomorrow then it becomes the enriched uranium files that are being moved to there unbeknownst to people by the same kind of network, because the same kind of local law enforcement people are being bought off by the bigger networks. So I think it's this local global connection and a re-strategizing based in strong intelligence that's the way to go.
Why don't you go ahead, and then I have another I think we could fit into.
I realize I've spoken before, so thank you very much for the courtesy. I was in Vietnam. I was also home. There was an emotion, and that emotion was on the street, but it was an emotion that was sensed and felt. And you mentioned as to the political elections and where is America's emotions as they can stand expressed and to take us forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready for another one?
Yeah.
I have actually a couple, but one that I didn't ask earlier. In a country with warring factions such as Iraq, does security trump liberty? In order to keep Sunnis from killing Shias, will a large security presence always be necessary, and could this sort of institution ever be both effective and democratic? Boy, that's a big one.
Yeah, and I heard we were running out of time.
So we'll just skip that. Yeah, let's move on. No, I'm kidding.
No. This is a very, very important issue, because if there's one of the things that separates, whether it be Iraq or it be Guatemala or Vietnam, or the difference between a struggling, fledgling quasi-democracy or democracy and a major, long-standing democracy like in Europe and the United States and Canada, is that we believe in both ends, and we're going to struggle for both ends, security and liberty. Security has less and less meaning to us if we've compromised our liberty. Liberty has less and less meaning if it provides no security. And we continually struggle, as we have about everything from Guantanamo to the Patriot Act to other things, about how we balance that. And it's a huge engaged process for us. And we're fortunate enough to have a court system where we can fight some of this out at its most basic levels. In fledgling regions, they enjoy liberty for a time, but they consider it so vulnerable that they're going to make an error in the security direction. And so you suspend liberties today in order to protect them for tomorrow. And that may have its place, provided tomorrow you try out liberty again. But it often leads to ongoing security crises, military dictatorships, and the like. It's very difficult to get that wheel spinning, especially if you don't have effective and democratic law enforcement and don't have a court system. Yet another reason why we're incredibly blessed in the system that we're in.
Okay. Well, I think that's, is that all we have time for, Ellen? I have another one here that I didn't ask, shall I? Well, it's getting to the question of Pakistan, and I actually had a question about Pakistan myself, too. Is the continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan merely a strategy to add pressure on Pakistan? Would you like to comment at all about, where we stand with Pakistan and whether we should be friendly with Pakistan or getting tougher on Pakistan, and whether Afghanistan's just a way to get to Pakistan?
I mentioned before that I thought it's very, very difficult to forge an internal peace in a factional war if all the neighbors aren't on board.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly problematic in an Afghan-Pakistan situation when you're not only talking a neighbor geographically, but a strategic partner with varied allegiances, as we all know, to different factions in Afghanistan. We have no choice but to be engaged with Pakistan. There's no reason not to be engaged with Pakistan for a whole series of reasons that even go beyond Afghanistan because of nuclear issues and the like. We have dealt with and had more crises with other allies in the past. Some of us in this room remember screaming between the French and the Americans in the 50s and 60s, and the threatened French withdrawal from NATO and tearing the heart of the strategic alliance right out by their stubbornness about this and this, those dastardly French. And then it passed. This is one of the versions of how that plays out among strategic partners. It's more uncertain, it's more difficult territory, it's more cultural, it's obviously related to transnational terrorism, it's related to religious beliefs, it's also related to the terrible dynamic of a large, powerful state and a relatively weak quasi-state. And with that structural dynamic, Pakistan will always hold us in a love-hate relationship. We can deal with that. The end game is what's important. Can we increase the capacity and the willingness of the Pakistanis to understand terrorists in their midst are not useful for their own survival? And unless we are there for the internal Pakistan fight for that, whatever effort we put in Afghanistan may have been meaningless.
Well, thank you very much. I want you all to join me in thanking
Thank
Professor
you.
Lopez for all of his great insights and ideas he had for us about the whole complicated region. We gave you a big task, and I think you really did a great job trying to sort some of that out. So thank you very much.